Hi, I'm William F. Bryant, and this is my podcast, VOPED. This is going to be another big business segment. I'm going to talk about supply chains, more or less just what they consist of and how you can think of them, so you get an idea and an understanding of what they are and how they affect operations in your business. Obviously, it became a really big thing through 2020 and still continuing on to this through this year and probably for a little bit. Supply chains end up being a little bit confusing because people oftentimes just look at a company, and I just call it wall to wall. You know, when your shipment of materials comes in to when it goes back on the dock and you're going out to your distribution channels to bring it to your customers, whoever that may be and wherever you fit in the chain. But a supply chain is full, if you want to think of it, it's full end to end, from the very rawest sourcing of whatever materials you need for your product, all the way down to the very last end user. And if you look at it that way, along that entire chain can be many different customers and many different suppliers and many different just firms in general, making products that will eventually go to the final end user, which is usually a customer at a store of some sort, you know. Now, let's go and continue with the Tshirt Company, or clothing company, just because that's an easy one to go with. And consider, not to be too much on the political side of it, but obviously the forced labor for the picking of cotton in China, and this is causing a lot of political upheaval in China and boycotts to different companies because they're not supporting the Chinese forced labor. And of course, you can't really, when you're running operations, you're never going to completely avoid the political aspects that are associated with certain things that your company may or may not be a part of, and it's why economics is and markets are a behavioral, have a very heavy behavioral component that goes with them, and it's why I fully endorse and support a behavioral view of the marketplace. And that isn't because I can't do the math and the modeling. I mean, that's where all of my background actually comes from, is the STEM side of things. But the fact of the matter is that all of those are done in such a way because modeling gives you a place to go from. It's the simplest component. It's the simplest arrangement of scenarios. You control all variables except one, and then you let that one kind of waver, and then you see how things change, and it gives you an idea. It gives you a basis from where you're going to go from, and that's, you know, everything from projecting sales to stock pricing to changes in use of inventory if you're going to change your technology or anything of that sort. And so if you understand it from that basis, then you get where models can be good. But the people who rely on them, they don't really understand what they're for, and they probably don't really understand where they came from. Anyway, that being said, let's go back to the cotton source. Once again, you've got the politicized sourcing of cotton, and this becomes important because when the majority of the manufacturing was moved out of the U.S. to other countries, and I won't really get into it on this one, but a lot of it did end up in China, and so that's where they are trying to draw natural resources to supply a lot of the cotton for the weaving of fabrics, which will eventually go into products that generally get shipped to the United States. So that's, you know, where you're looking at, regardless of whether that's a component in the chain or not. The fact is that when you're dealing in fibers and fabrics for your your T-shirt company, you only have a few select choices. You have natural fibers, synthetic, and then you obviously have blends. But they kind of all go through a similar weaving process, and I mean, it doesn't really matter if you look at the shirt or clothing that you're wearing, and it's made of cotton. That's exactly you have the cotton, and it's got to then be from. It's got to be. It's not really. I don't know if woven's the right word, but it's got to be rolled together into string. And actually, the way they make string is it's a fascinating thing to watch. And if you don't really know how string is made or rope, a lot of rope is made out of flax, and how they get the strands to go and actually create thread. It's a fascinating way that the fibers actually twist together and create kind of like natural knots. But once it's created into that string, it then goes on and has to be put on a loom of some sort and actually woven into the sheets of thread. It's similar to the way that you would make a rug or something of that sort. Maybe you crochet or knit. Maybe you've seen your folks or grandfolks crochet or knit. But that's the concept, and it using it in an industrial setting doesn't really change it. The process just becomes done on more of a scaled factor. You know, you add technology and machinery, and all of a sudden you can make huge square yards of material from just basic thread. Which is also kind of an interesting thing to throw in here a little bit when you're thinking about technologies in your company, is the fact that, how much technology do you need? What do you need to produce? How much of it? What are you actually going to put out to the public? Because there's obviously more than you need, which would be excess capacity, but also costs significantly more. And then there's not being able to supply it quickly enough, which suffers sales as well. So just a little tidbit. But as it moves down the chain and then becomes the fabric, then that fabric has to go through kinds of processes to be dyed and rolled into sheets and then shipped out to other places that then cut it into patterns, and those patterns are then sewn together, which then you put your unique touches on them, and perhaps they get sent to you, perhaps you have it where if it's ordered, it's sent from another facility and is sent on to the consumer, or it goes to a store and they hold it for sales for when the consumer comes in to purchase it. But if you look from where it comes and how it starts, and obviously you're kind of towards the end of that supply, because when it gets to you for your store, I mean, you're pretty much selling right to consumer, or you're going to a distribution center, which is going to sell right to a consumer. And so the manufacturers along the way, who are the ones who are going to create string and then weave it into actual fabric and then dye it, and whatever the process goes, there's probably different companies that do each process. Just simply because if you simplify the steps and you become really good at specific steps, and those are all the only materials you need, then it actually lowers the cost of lowers the cost of each step, or making the components, whatever you're doing. And so the risks obviously inherent in that would be if you're going to source out natural fibers. Well, say you've got cotton or wool. Well, obviously cotton, that's grown from plants. Wool is animals. And the things that affect the output of crops or the animals, everything from natural disasters to disease outbreak, to just simply maybe farmers or worker strike, and then you can't pick it, or you can't shear it, or whatever the case may be, way up at the beginning of the chain. Well, that's going to affect not only you, but probably your competitors. It depends on how many people are actually able to supply that step in the chain and where they're at in relation to you and who you're ordering from. But you do get just a handful of suppliers as you move to that raw material sourcing way up the chain as it moves down. And so that becomes obviously inherent risk that many companies took for granted. They just kind of made the assumption that that was going to be there and the product was always going to be sourced. If they put in an order, yeah, that order's coming. And for the most part, in a smoothly operating chain with, little to no variability in their output, yeah, you're gonna see that. And for an awful lot of stuff, like even agriculture, it's consistent, and you're going to see the same output year to year without, minus a natural disaster of some sort, and then you're going to see the pricing go up, and for a short period of time you might see pricing go up in the store, but usually not by much. If the prices go up and it's considered to be for a very short period of time, mostly the producers, you in this case, or the sellers, will eat a lot of that cost into their margin, even up to a degree where you might be a little bit negative for a very brief period of time, because it's oftentimes better to keep that from the consumer, because if the consumer changes the opinion about your brand and your pricing, they may not come back to buy from you, depending on how long that was. And so if you're on that last step to go to the customer, you may not want to adjust your pricing if you think that pricing is going to be just for a brief period of time. You're going to eat a lot of that cost, which is why, in this current state, when they're talking about transitory inflation and the price adjustments have been slow to adjust to the inflation, that's where it comes in, because you don't want to jack prices up and then jack them back down. The one exception to that, generally speaking, is energy costs and oil, which you see those fluctuate all the time if you drive a car and visit the gas station pumps. So a little bit about that, more about that pricing along those lines. And you obviously notice this as you buy from your supplier. They charge you a particular amount to purchase their supply, whatever it may be, and that's the same thing all the way down the line. And from the time when you're actually harvesting or shearing or synthetically producing, you can do obviously synthetic fibers for a lot of your materials and shirts. Each one along the way tacks on a little bit of a profit margin, whatever it considers is going to be an acceptable profit margin. And it may do this way. It may leave it a little bit more freer than that when it comes to actually determining its pricing, because if you're way up the chain, contracts and future contracts are a little bit more common, especially for raw materials, than when you get down into where the t-shirts are cut and sewn together and maybe imprinted. And so if each component along the line adds a little bit more of a price, you can see where you get some of the pricing mechanism when you actually put it on the shelf for the consumers to buy. And that's where some of your cost comes into play, when you actually have to buy the materials. Okay. And so what you should be able to see also in terms of this pricing, and I want to keep talking about inflation here because it's prevalent right now during the time period we're in. And if you're operating a business, you're going to have to prepare for inflation that isn't transitory. And regardless of how many times the Fed says it, it's not. And so you're going to have to start to prep. Some of the things that I've seen companies already do is to set up where they actually keep additional inventory on hand. The one company that I use for a lot of the examples on my business website actually keeps 2 years of inventory available and on hand. And they're in the alcoholic beverage industry, and they're probably what you'd consider mid-size in terms of actual sales. They do about 11 billion a year, which it's tough because you're either dealing with the really big, Anheuser-Busch, Miller Coors, or your microbreweries, and so they're somewhere in between. But nonetheless, they keep 2 years of inventory on hand so they can keep their supply going were there to be any disruptions. And they obviously handle a lot of agricultural type ingredients to go into their products. And so when you're dealing in a company like a t-shirt clothing company, cotton becomes a big issue. In fact, anything during periods of inflation, any commodity becomes a big issue, because what happens is the currency purchases less and less. And if you roll it all the way back to the people who are actually harvesting or shearing or creating the product, and then having to do shipments and actually just going through the process of doing their bit in the chain, it takes energy, which is oil, gas, and materials of that nature, without even getting into the bit where they actually have to, work out distribution to get it to their customers. They still have to use that in order to get their employees. Their employees have to go to work. Obviously, their employees have to go through and probably use machinery to actually do some of the harvesting, the planting, and all of the prep work. A lot of your fertilizers also use bits and pieces of energy components, which people probably don't really know. But all of those things costs tick up, and oil and energy is expensive in the best of times when you're not expecting extreme bumps in inflation. When inflationary periods hit, it all of a sudden amplifies the cost significantly. You can see costs, especially just on their end, start bumping 5, 8, maybe even 10%. And if it does for them, like I said, they pass little portions of costs all the way down so they can make some kind of a profit. And a lot of times they try to, as I mentioned, they try to eat some of that cost. But if it's long run and they start projecting that it's going to be long run, prices start to jump all the way down the line, and that's where you see them rise finally at you. And these don't have to be huge jumps in terms of like the way you see them. It can be pennies on the dollar. People oftentimes, they forget when things are measured in percentages, because percentages, I've always considered them a little bit deceiving if you're not thinking of them on as to what they actually represent. And so I like to go back and actually think of the value or the pricing of what it is. And if you're running a 10% increase, that's, a dime on every dollar, right? And so usually you don't see those big of jumps. You actually just see maybe 3%. So it's 3 cents on every dollar. So if something costs, $3, that's a 9-cent jump. So it goes to 3.09 if it used to be 3, right? And so that doesn't seem like a lot until you add up those 3% on many, 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 many items. And see, this is the thing where people mix up how it affects supply chains and what you're actually going to be doing as a company, because it can affect or impact all the components if it's inflation across the board. If it's just in certain areas and you're dealing in risks, for example, like when I was talking about harvest risks, storms, things of that nature, it may only affect your cotton. It may not affect energy prices at that point in time. So maybe you don't feel the whole brunt of it. But if you all of a sudden see it start to affect energy, and then it affects cotton harvesting and pricing, and then on top of that, it might have an effect on the next one down when they're actually doing their manufacturing process to create string. Well, it will probably affect their upkeep. If a machine goes down, they're going to have to purchase additional machines. It might affect their cost of carry, maybe their rent and their insurance go up if they're having to hold inventory because they're anticipating future increases in pricing. So maybe they're going to want to have a little bit more inventory and a little bit more inventory. And of course, as you see people wanting to hold a little bit more inventory, that also contributes to a little bit more rising prices unless somebody increases capacity or has the capacity to produce that much, which also plays into the way a supply chain works. So there are a number of things that you have to consider, and if you're dealing in a product that is going to be sensitive to these kinds of things, that's where I mention that you need to understand your supply chain, because when you get to your part, then you have to determine things like how much product do I want to hold? How dependent am I upon discretionary income whims, which is kind of like the amount of money people have available to just simply spend on a product? And obviously, if you're in t-shirt and clothing, a lot of those stores took big hits the last year because people weren't really going out. They weren't shopping for nights outs and dinners, and they weren't shopping to go to the office, so they weren't buying business suit clothes or blouses and skirts and things of that nature. There wasn't that kind of spending in an awful lot of areas because people didn't really know what was going to happen and how it was going to go forward. And so you're sitting there with your product, and you're sitting there in the line, and you have to make all of these decisions about what you're going to do and in where you're going to be at in the whole supply chain as well. So hopefully, I'm trying to think if there's, without going too far into a lot of the rest of it, those are a lot of the segments that you have to think of. Like, where's it coming from? What are the costs that your suppliers are going to be dealing with all the way up and all the way down to you? And then where are you in the entire chain, and how are your customers going to react, and what do they need to do to react? And so you have to start to determine all kinds of things, not the least of which is actually your accounts receivable and your accounts payables. How much cash are you going to have to keep on hand? Are you going to start seeing more accounts go 30, 60, 90? What are you going to start to see as this goes on and happens? And so your supply chain really, it's obviously one of your biggest expenditures, because what you're holding in your assets, as you see on your accounting statements, usually are an awful lot of accounts receivable, inventories, prepaid expenses, and then obviously offset by your accounts payables and your accounts or your prepaid expenses. And so that's your working capital. But that's what you have to do your supply, and you're in the chain, and you're working as this kind of an agreement, but at the same time, it's a competitive marketplace. But you're really, the way companies are set up are to set up to do these flows. You start with commodities and you go all the way down to the consumer base, and because of this and how the supply chains work, that's why I really wanted to mention this little tidbit. And always just remember, in times of inflation, it's commodities, and that's a big key to what you have to do to go ahead and start planning to how you're going to operate. Were the rates to get out of hand or start to be dramatically different than what they were historically? Just a thought there on some components of supply chains.